Good morning, everybody. Just a quick sound check. Can everybody hear and see as well? I see a couple of people found the chat, but can you please let us know whether the audio is okay? Okay, excellent. Well, a couple of people can hear us, so let's assume that goes the same for
everybody can hear us.
Exactly. Welcome again to this webinar on driving growth with innovation. It's the last in a series of 4 in which we address several key innovation topics. Today, we will talk about how to develop innovation competence and the culture of your company.
Yeah, and exactly. And this is like Mark said, this is the 4th in the series of 4. And we basically we run these webinars on the 4 characteristics of successful innovators, or best-in-class innovators, as we call them. And what distinguishes these companies from others is that they have a well-defined innovation strategy and roadmap, which we talked about in our first webinar of this series. Further on, they manage their innovation portfolio professionally, which was the topic of the second webinar. Then they embed innovation in their organization fully. And for the topic of today, we will talk about, let's say, the continuous development of innovation competences, innovation culture, and leadership.
Yeah, we're in a bit of a Roman theme, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So during maybe you've seen it in the intro movie, and you also see it during the presentation that we took some inspiration from the Romans, since we were talking about culture, and I think they are obviously rich in culture. But also, if you look at if you look at our book there, and if you've read it, we often reference the medieval ages, the Roman ages, but also Da Vinci. So it's a bit of a hobby of ours. But anyway. So.
Well, then just to introduce yourself, for those of you who are for the first time in our webinars, my name is Mark Dauma. I'm partner at RevelX. Next to me, as always, is Matthijs Rosman. We will be your host for this webinar. And as always as well, we have our commercial chief, Rob Nouwens, who is not on screen, but he's behind the controls. He's going to make sure everything runs smoothly. We're a boutique consultancy firm. We help our clients to realize growth through innovation. We work for large corporates as well as smaller scale-ups that aim to become a large corporate. We have quite a bit of an experience in a range of different industries. And the reason for organizing these webinars is that we are quite passionate about innovation, and also about sharing the insights that we've developed in the many years we've worked with our clients, with ups and downs, with successes and mistakes, and as you can expect in any innovation project. And if we take a look at what we're going to discuss today, here's the click. We're going to cover 5 topics. First of all, we're going to address the importance of developing innovation competence and culture. We'll look at a bit of some data from our innovation benchmark. We will then explain the role of leadership and how they can foster innovation. The next topic is like a super summary, a high-speed summary of what we call the DARE mindset, which is written in our book. And that's really about the individuals in your team. But even if you have people with the right mindset, innovation will not be successful if the culture is toxic for innovation. So that's a key challenge for corporates, especially when they're disrupted by agile startups that are not hindered by corporate bureaucracy and so on. So culture is quite key to innovation. And our last topic is how you can actually develop innovation skills and competencies. Because, well, your team does not only have to be willing to innovate, that I think is about mindset and culture, yep, but they also must be able to do so, which is all about competencies. If you have questions, you can always ask them in the chat. We like to pick up those questions as we go along and try to answer them as long as they fit a bit in the storyline, of course. We also have prepared some polls to keep it interactive, and I think we're going to start with
let's start with,
right away.
Start with the first one, and you'll see in the pop out on the right side of the screen the poll appear. And what we're really curious to hear from you guys, as we're talking about innovation culture, and Mark just alluded to, a culture can be toxic, but it should be supportive to innovation. Is what does the culture in your organization look like? Is it an innovation wasteland, meaning innovation comes to die here? Is it sort of characterized by the sandy shores with a lot of effort, innovation can actually grow? Are you in the green meadows where innovation actually gets room to breathe, or we really would like to speak to these people. Are you in an innovation oasis where innovation can spawn freely? Let's see where you guys are, or what you're.
And if you're working as a consultant, we always say, please answer these questions, referring to your last client or your most favorite client, whatever you like.
Yeah.
Well, we have some good news, Matthijs, because, well, there's good and bad news. Nobody is in the wasteland, and that's at least promising.
Yeah.
Most people are a bit of in the sandy shores, which I think relates to the challenge, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. And then, well, congratulations to the people in the Green Meadows. That's obviously smooth sailing if you're there, and no oasis. So that's well, anyway.
Which is maybe the reason why people are here.
Hopefully, yes. Hopefully, yes. So let's dive into the topic of today, and we'd like to start with the importance of innovation culture and competence. And if you look at sort of literature, and also we describe it in our book there as well. So the importance for having an innovation culture and having the right competences in place is actually widely acknowledged, and they are often referred to as well, let's say, that more of the softer elements of the organization. But at the same time, them being soft, they're the hardest to develop.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a strong innovation culture, or a culture that's inducive to innovation, and you don't have the right leadership and competences in place, well, it's almost an uphill battle. And if you want to become, let's say, a serious innovator, or at least be part of that best-in-class innovator segment, as we like to look at it, you should always look at the soft elements in conjunction with the harder elements of innovation strategy, portfolio management, and process. So, why bother with innovation? And I think, or with innovation culture and competences. Mark already talked about the research we're doing with the Innovation Readiness Benchmark, and actually, our research shows that, if you pay attention to innovation culture and competence, that it's going to pay off, in the end. And if you look at our benchmark, we distinguish between, let's say, low and high performers in our benchmark, and which is basically a score on 5 criteria relating to innovation performance. And we've created 7 building blocks around the best practices for best-in-class innovators. And we see that, innovation culture and innovation competence are 2 of the, let's say, most important, or actually very important ones when it comes to driving growth through innovation. If we then look at sort of the relationship between innovation competences and innovation success, or innovation leadership or performance, we see that only 9% of companies who are low performers in our benchmark rates high on the skills and competences required for successful innovation. If we then move on and looking at the sort of medium performers, so companies which are so-so in terms of innovation success, it's 24% who rate high on skills and competence. But if you then look at the high performers, it's immediately bumps up to 64% of the companies who rate themselves high on skills and competences, which sort of shows that there's a direct relation, or at least there's an implied relationship between innovation performance and skills and competences.
Yeah, and then if we look at the second topic of today, which is culture, this relation is even stronger, or clearer, if you like, because there we see 10% of the low performers that rate high on innovation culture, which is about the same for competencies. Yeah. 31%, which is higher than for competencies, rates high on innovation culture, so of the medium performers. And if we then look at the high performers in our benchmark who rate well on the criteria for innovation performance, 73 of them says, well, we're actually also quite good at, or our innovation culture is actually quite well developed, which underlines once again the old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, you could almost say.
Yeah. It also eats innovation for breakfast.
It also, well, I would say it fosters innovation, Matthijs. Having said that, if you're interested, you can always have a look at our website and join our innovation readiness benchmark. It's quite an easy tool. It takes about 8 to 10 minutes to complete, and you'll be able to assess your innovation power on 35 best practices, 5 criteria for innovation performance, and Rob will then make a personal report for you and send it to you, and that will also compare your assessment against the more than 350 companies that are already in our database. So you get a good feel for where you are in terms of innovation power, and also where you should start in terms of developing that. That could be strategy for the one company, but it could also be culture or competences, the topic of today.
Yeah, okay. So let's dive into innovation leadership as a first topic. And I think we all know the examples of, let's say, the visionary leaders like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk that sort of seemingly single-handedly drive innovation within their organizations. But we feel that successful innovation is not sort of left to those highbrow type of innovators, and it's also within the reach of, let's say, the more ordinary leaders in business. And if you look at the benchmark, again, as we just explained, one of the 35 best practices one of the 35 best practices in our benchmark, one is around leadership and involvement of leadership in key innovation projects. And this is actually where the strong performers rate highest. And you actually see here on the screen that on a scale of 1 to 5, they score an average of 4.5, where key or leadership is involved in key innovation projects. And if you compare that to the weak performers, that's quite a significant difference of 3.1. So if we then sort of dive into what leadership involvement actually means, it doesn't actually mean that you actually do that you manage those projects directly. It's about a leader fulfilling an active sponsor role, for example. So actually creating the right environment for innovation. It's also obviously about making time and budget available for innovation. And a very important role for leadership is to provide air cover to innovation teams. So when the organization provides pushback, or an external environment provides pushback, that leadership is actually comes in and provides the air cover that's needed for those teams. It's also about making tough calls, right? So it's like making decisions. We very often see that innovation projects, they sort of keep going on and on and on without taking any sort of significant steps. And it's often to leadership to make those decisions to either stop or push innovation through. On the other end, it's also about coaching people. It's about challenging myths and beliefs in the organization, and it's about creating psychological safety. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the in our webinar. So, well, if you put it very simply, I mean, a leadership involvement means that you just create the right conditions for innovation within an organization by taking away the obstacles.
Yeah. So Matthijs just talked about a number of things that you can do practically as an innovation leader, to promote innovation. In addition to that, we have also uncovered some, you could say, common characteristics of innovation leaders that they determine whether they can do that successfully. Because it's one thing to know what you need to do, but you also need to do it successfully. And that's, among others, based on many interviews our colleague Eric de Groot has conducted with business leaders on the topic of managing innovation. We, by the way, bundled some of those interviews in the download that Rob will now make available. So I think it's interesting background reading material.
Yeah.
Please note that, well, the topic obviously is quite confidential or sensitive, you could say. So we've decided to keep the interviews anonymous, which means that we could, elaborate more on the specific topics than if there were to be unnamed cases. But rest assured, they are real-life case examples based on the interviews that Eric has done in the past, half year, you could say.
The past year. And again, if you have any questions or are inspired by the content, then just reach out and we can have a conversation about them.
And again, you can always leave questions in the chat and we'll pick them up along the way. But let's go back again to the characteristics of innovation leaders. And we've uncovered, I think, around 6 of them. And first of all, it's about envisioning. You need to have a clear vision on where you need to go to. Well, it almost is an open door, you could say, but we still see organizations where when it comes to innovation, there's not a clear vision on how that should be developed. And this is really about setting the ambition, having situational awareness and creating an outside-in view for your company. It's also about the flexibility to adapt the course if changes occur, and changes occur inevitably. So that's the first one. Second one is, well, you can have the vision, but you also need to walk the talk. And that's, bringing it into practice, spread the vision throughout the organization, and make sure that what we call the innovation virus, contaminates the rest of the organization.
In a positive way.
In a positive way, not in a COVID kind of way, you could say. But to do that really requires perseverance. And that's, I think, another key characteristic of innovation leaders. It's not backing away from innovation with the first setback, and you will have those setbacks inevitably. It's also not backing away when you have the first disappointing quarterly results. That's what we also see happening a lot. We start big, interesting programs. One of our clients at this point is now running a big ERP implementation. Well, and they always, tend to consume resource, consume time, and consume a lot of money, by the way. But then still, you need to sort of keep driving innovation, as you go. And that's really, when the going gets tough, you need to stay focused on the long term and what is important for keeping the long-term relevance of your business. So that's perseverance.
Yeah. And we just talked about, I just talked about making tough decisions. Again, one of the characteristics of innovation leaders, and I think you should also acknowledge within your organization that innovation is not always a democratic process, right? So at some point, somebody has to take some decisions and has to push the process forward. And this is typically the role for innovation leaders. And this is a challenging one since it requires, a balancing, your gut feel with facts and data, and you have to be aware of your biases and make sure that they don't come into play. And just focus on what the data is telling you. The other characteristic of successful innovation leaders is that they are sort of enablers, right? So in the previous section, we talked about creating the right conditions for innovation. And enabling really revolves around let's say, putting your money where your mouth is, right? So we often come in situations that we hear, leadership talk about the importance of innovation and also spreading the word within the organization, but also outside of the organization. But they're not sort of backing it up with, getting all the right conditions in place, like the right resources and budgets. And and that is actually a lack of commitment from leadership, and which is killing for innovation, obviously. The sixth characteristic of innovation leaders is that they're really good coaches, right? So that they empower teams within their organization, and that they don't fall in the trap of, say, the command and control style of leadership, which is not very conducive for innovation. In there we describe a section which we call the rarely asked questions, and those are actually questions which challenge innovation teams, which actually you don't answer for your innovation teams, but you challenge them through rarely asked questions and have them come up with the answers themselves. And that's really an important one to put into.
Yeah, I think that also relates back to the previous webinars. In the third one, we talked about the organization of innovation and the role of a growth board.
Yeah.
Well, that's typically where you want to bring the key leaders together.
Yeah.
To basically manage your whole innovation funnel, not in a command and control type of way, but by asking those questions.
Yeah.
And that then relates back to the second webinar in which we talked about portfolio management, because the questions will differ along the way.
Absolutely.
If you're in the first phase of the innovation funnel, the exploration kind of phase, you'll be asking different questions from when you're close to launching the innovation. And we've I think built sort of, well, it's not a database, but it's kind of an overview of the questions that you need to ask in each stage of the innovation process. In order to get the right dialogue, because I think that's where you really want to be, that you have a dialogue with your innovation teams instead of telling them what you think is right or what you think is wrong, which relates back to Matthijs's previous point on, looking at the data and not looking at your own personal, assumptions, etc.
Exactly. And I think that list of questions is available with our third webinar. So if you want that list, then
or just reach out to Rob and he will make it available to you. Rob is already looking forward.
It's getting very busy.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next topic in this webinar, which is about mindset. And mindset, well, that's what we think is a key driver for innovation, even to the extent that Matthijs and the already mentioned colleague Eric de Groot have written an entire book about it. And when you look at leadership, it is very close to mindset, and people will immediately feel, within the company, if leadership is not fully behind it. As Matthijs already said, if you're not enabling, if you're not walking the talk, it's kind of killing for innovation. But it's obviously not depending on one person. That will be almost disappointing. So for an organization to be truly innovative, you need to have enough individuals with an innovation mindset to be able to create an innovation culture. So a culture that is not suffocated by the bureaucrats, by the complacents, by the skeptics, or the conservatives that you will inevitably also find in your organization. Even if you're in a more scale-up type of organization, you'll also have those. And based on our many years of experience, we've concluded that innovation is all about what we call a dare mindset. And dare, well, it's obviously daring, you have to dare, but it's also an acronym, and it stands for defiance, adventure, realism, and endurance. And well, let's have a closer look at the 4 key elements of a dare mindset. And who can better explain that than the guy who actually wrote the book about it?
Yeah, so thank you very much. And so the book actually came about as it was a happy accident. Let's call it that way. We set out to write a series of blog posts on the topic, and then once we were done, we looked at it and said, well, actually, this is an entire book, so why not publish a book? But what we distinguish in the dare mindset is there's basically 2 houses, what we call the D and the A, versus the R and the E. And if you look at defiance and adventure, they really represent what we call sort of the creative destruction element of innovation. And so they break down the status quo and they let the new reality emerge out of the rumbles of the status quo. And realism and endurance are let's say more of the left side of the brain, which is more an analytical approach, a cognitive approach. And when combining the 2 things, it's very much about doing the right things and doing the right things right. So that's sort of that's the balancing of the 2. If you then look at defiance, and defiance really is the definition of challenging that status quo. As I said, it's about challenging the myths and beliefs in an organization or a system, an industry, a country, or whatever. And it's about seeing the diamonds in the rough, right? So the stuff that other people don't see or don't want to see. And I think today we talked about Leonardo da Vinci as being sort of our poster boy for defiance. But if you look at today, I think it's more the Elon Musk type of people who are willing to look at an industry or and totally rethink what it can be. And there's this famous example when he started to re-envision commercial space flight, that his sort of childhood heroes Neil Armstrong and Gene Cernan were actually opposing a commercial space flight, and he was really devastated by it, but he pushed on anyway. So that's defiance in action.
Yeah, that's about the courage to act. And again, it doesn't have to be that those visionary types like Elon Musk. We've worked at clients where Take, for example, BDR Thermia, which is a 2 billion company in the heating industry. One of their business unit directors running the UK business. We did a lot of work with him on their new product development, innovation process. And at a certain point, and he said, well, Mark, you know, and sometimes we have the projects we just do.
Yeah.
And that was saying, well, there are projects that are so key to our business where I just forget about all the corporate procedures and we just do them.
We just go ahead.
And that's just, again, going against sort of the established order. I think it's a nice example of the courage to act, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So moving on with the acronym to the A, it's called adventure, and adventures are the people who go on a journey, right? So they set out to uncover something new. They're curious, they're looking for the new. They're not afraid to fail and actually see every failure as a learning opportunity and really embrace the concept of fail as an acronym of, you know, first attempt in learning. And actually again in there we write about, you know, the adventurers being Peter Pan, who actually is on a constant journey, if you will, constantly trying to uncover something new. But again, also I think in our practice we also have some adventurers, right, which we work with.
Yeah, exactly. I've been working now for, I think it's almost 6 years, for Ensecure, which is the market leader in the Netherlands in quite advanced access control solutions. So that's basically giving people access to building sites and so on. And they're part of Unica. And their CEO, Hans van Driel, he's I think the ultimate adventurer in a sense. And people, they all get tired of him because he continuously keeps on looking for kind of new businesses, new propositions to develop. They recently acquired a company, by the way. We're developing numerous strategic alliances, and I think he's really a guy
who's always on a quest.
He's always on a quest, and in doing so, they are now the most innovative company in their space, which is typically almost like, you know, traditional installation business, but they've developed a SaaS platform around it. Yeah. So I think that's about the adventure. And to a certain extent, people are always happy when I sort of come in then again to sort of clean up the dust behind him and then bring in some realism, which I think is the next topic.
Exactly, yeah. And when we talk about realism, I think one person who comes to mind is the former CEO of BDR Thermia, the company Mark just talked about. And when we were talking about innovation or digital transformation, his standard question was always, how many extra boilers are we going to sell? And so that really is the voice of realists, and those are the people who are sort of trying to look at the facts. They're trying to make sense of it. They're looking at the business side of things. So how can we make a business out of this? Oftentimes they're also the data scientists in the organization, and they try to make rhyme and reason of the endeavors of the adventurers. Again, in our book, we talk about realists in the terms of let's say the Grey Wizard, for the people who like Lord of the Rings. So people are actually the wise people within the organization, and always go back to, okay, why are we doing things, and does it make sense? And so those are the realists. And then the E stands for endurance, and when we talk about endurance, we talk about the hard work to make things happen, the long grind, about the disciplined execution that's required to see innovation through. And actually, we found that there are few people in organizations who actually have the stamina to do this, right? So to really take on a project and see it through to its end, and especially not the people who are sort of in the D and the A.
They get bored. When
yes.
you get to that phase.
Exactly. So it takes a lot of preparation and to pull off and execute an innovation right. And we often make the reference to like extreme mountaineers, right, who spend a lot of time preparing for a quest up a mountain. And it's that thoughtful preparation process and the hard work that goes with endurance. And if you go back to our practice, we are proud partners of a company called JMango, and they make mobile e-commerce applications. and their CEO.
It's a scale-up.
It's a scale-up company, exactly. And Barry, their CEO, he went through many iterations and many pivots to get the business model right.
Many financing rounds.
Exactly. And to make it happen. So I think for me, he is one of the most enduring and CEOs that I've met in the past couple of years.
Exactly. Yeah. And as we said, the guys with the D and the A, they get bored when you get to the execution, or they could get bored. So I think it's important to acknowledge that you will rarely find a person who has all the dare traits down to an art. You can have them, but mostly one or more of those elements is less developed. So it takes a team to make it happen, and you could even need to switch people along the way.
Yeah.
And we always call that kind of what you need is you need hipsters, hackers, and hustlers. And hipsters, those are the defined ones, the creatives. You need at the early stage. Hackers, they go on the adventure to make it happen. They find the clever solution and the workarounds. But ultimately, you also need the hustlers, the slick ones who make a business out of it. Because in the end, if it's not going to sell, the innovation is not successful. So then the question is, if you look at there and the elements that Matthijs just explained, the D, defiance, adventure, realism, endurance, which element is best developed in yourself? So it's a bit more of a personal question. But see, what do you think is the best developed element of there for yourself? Not for your organization, but for yourself.
Let's see.
Nobody dares to answer. You see that, Matthijs? Is the poll open, Rob? Or it is.
Okay. Who wants to have a first go?
This is the first, Matthijs, that nobody. Interesting.
Maybe people in the chat, can you see if there's
is the poll available to everybody?
Oh, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
No.
Okay. Well, then we need to leave this one.
There he goes. There's one.
Well, somehow we had a glitch, but as I said, Rob is going to make sure everything runs smoothly, and he just did. And again.
Comes to save the day.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
So, realists, adventurers coming up, people with endurance.
Actually, we're having a great innovation team over here. If we combine all these people.
It's quite well balanced. Yeah.
It's quite well balanced, although we could have had a bit more defiance and endurance, because we see that adventure and realism are more sort of taking more answers.
It's interesting because in the book we refer to Leonardo da Vinci as being sort of the quintessential dare practitioner, and but even he doesn't have sort of all of the traits of dare in him. He uses other people to actually to complete his work. So he wasn't very good at finishing things. So
it's good to see that if we were to make an innovation team out of these people, we have at least a couple of people who can sort of do the disciplined execution, and we have a couple of people who are defiant enough to go against the established order.
If we were to look at this team, we would have a very rich innovation pipeline.
Exactly, yeah. And probably also a good innovation culture, because let's move on to the next topic, where mindset is very much about individuals, cultures. Culture is basically the collective mindset of the organization. And that's often deeply rooted in the history of the organization. So bringing in a few people with a dare mindset will not necessarily change your culture. And culture typically, cultures that embrace innovation typically combine two values. They have an external focus and they allow differentiation, which is the one axis on this, the picture that is shown here. And the other, they combine that with being flexible instead of focused on stability and control. And if you have that external focus with the flexibility, you kind of, you're probably more of a disruptive innovator. If you're more on the external side on stability, you're more a proposition innovator. Then obviously internal stability, those are process improvers. You need those as well. And you can also be more focused on process innovation, which is, by the way, a good way of innovating your business as well.
Yep.
And then I think that also brings us to the topic of developing subcultures, because as we said, especially in larger organizations, there's typically not one single culture. You always have different cultures across different business units, but also across different departments. If I look at N-Secure within Unica, N-Secure is like, it's almost like run like a family business by Hans. It's really, adventuring, as we already said, where, well, you're part of a traditional installation company, which has different traits. And I think that what they do well is that they leave it as it is. They sort of embrace that subculture, and they're not going to try to change it into the bigger, more dominant culture. And that's something you can play with if you want to develop or create a more innovative culture. By the way, this was an acquisition, and that's one of the ways on how you can develop innovation cultures. And you especially have to consider that when you have a culture that is not necessarily good for innovation, but could fit very well with how the core business is successfully managed, because you don't have to change the entire culture. You should not even change that culture if it fits well with running an operationally excellent company.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things you can do. You can think of innovation labs, creating corporate startups, and as said, you can also think about acquisitions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and but when you do that, be wary of the stereotyping of cultural elements. And we always say, forget the stereotypes, right? If you look at what actually defines an innovation culture, it's not typically built in those stereotypes, like, for example, let's say the free format playgrounds without any rules or procedures. It's where people are held accountable for thinking outside the box and coming up with seemingly groundbreaking, disruptive ideas, where they rather sort of play hard instead of work hard. So those things they typically don't work when you're trying to build an innovative culture. But what we do see is that companies have to balance a number of paradoxes, and those paradoxes are basically combining two worlds: the world of creative innovation on the one hand, and the world of sort of operationally managing or running the business on the other hand. And what we see in successful innovators is they balance 5 paradoxes in a, let's say, what we call a powerful coexistence. And if you can do that, you can get to a culture which is which is actually conducive to innovation in a very productive way. And let's just go through these 5 paradoxes really quickly. And the first one revolves around being tolerant for failure, but yet being intolerant for incompetence. So we welcome you welcome the fact that people fail in the sense that they experiment, but at the same time they have to do this really well. So individual performance is something that is required, and it's a good start also from a leadership perspective to start articulating what you mean by that, right? So what is the difference between productive and unproductive failures? So that first paradox is about being tolerant to failures, but being intolerant to incompetence. So don't make it a sort of fuzzy merry-go-round. The second one is about being willing to experiment and yet at the same time being highly disciplined. And organizations that embrace experimentation, they are very comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, and but at the same time they should be very selective about what risks they are willing to take, and so what experiments they're willing to run, and set out some clear criteria of what is, let's say, within the confines of what's doable and acceptable, and what's outside of it. And so you have to be very clear about that. Then the third one, which is I talked about this before in this webinar very shortly, is about the paradox between psychological safety and being brutally candid. And psychological safety really revolves around giving people the freedom to criticize, to maybe openly challenge superiors' views, to debate other ideas of others in a constructive way, obviously, and also raise counter perspectives. And if you don't do that, innovation can really be crushed within an organization. Then it's psychologically unsafe. At the same time, the feedback you give people and the discussions you have, they have to be candid. They have to be real. So that's the third paradox that you have to manage within your organization.
Yeah. Fourth paradox is that too often collaboration gets confused with consensus. And consensus is, well, basically a poison for rapid decision making, navigating complex problems which are often associated with innovation. Because ultimately you need to collaborate, but you also need to have somebody who at a certain point decides and is accountable for it. And as one of my clients once remarked, when we had a kind of a tough discussion, and there were lots of different opinions, and he at one point said, "Mark, I'm not running a democracy here, so I'm now going to make a decision." I think that's also about leadership, listening to all the views, and then at a certain point take a decision if consensus cannot be reached. And that brings us also to the last paradox. In culturally flat organizations, people are giving a wide latitude to take action, make decisions, voice their opinions. It's really empowering, which is good for innovation. But lack of hierarchy, though, it does not mean lack of leadership. And we would always favor, as little hierarchy as possible. But paradoxically, a flat organization always also requires stronger leadership. And well, those are the 5 paradoxes that you need to consider. As Matthijs said, it's all about balance in the end, as with many things in life. But we were just wondering which of these paradoxes is the hardest for your organization. And let's see if the poll works.
Let's try another poll.
Let's try another poll.
Let's see.
What did you do last time, Rob?
I don't know. I think
It's working. It's working. Good.
Hooray. Yeah. So, which paradox is hardest for your organization? Okay.
So far, it's kind of evenly spread.
It seems to be that collaboration and individual accountability is something that's an issue. It's good to see that at least leadership is not perceived to be such an issue.
Yeah, but Matthijs, if we ask for which one is the hardest to manage, that doesn't. You have to pick one, eh?
That's
so
true.
It doesn't mean that the other ones are easy to manage.
It's competing commitments. That's right.
That's my scientific background here.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry for that. No, but I think just as Matthijs said, I think it's the collaboration yet individually accountable. I think that's a key one, and I think that's in the end also about ownership. People need to take ownership and then still be willing to collaborate. And we think it's interesting to think about these paradoxes and to see how they are sort of managed within your own organization if you want to develop a more innovative culture.
Yeah. Okay. So let's also, with an eye to the time, let's go to the sort of last topic of today's webinar, which is about developing innovation skills and competences. And it may sound like an open door, which has been kicked in many times, but actually developing skills and competences within your organization around innovation is key. But if you look at the data from our innovation readiness benchmark, it's only 29% of the company in our database which indicate that their people are well trained in innovative thinking and innovative tooling, and I think that's extremely low.
Yeah, and even for the higher performers, this was actually one of the best practices that is not scoring very high.
Yeah.
So, even though it's not that difficult to do something about it, we think at least. But we'll get to that later.
Given all of the topics that we discussed today, this might be the easier one. And
exactly.
Mark just previously talked about being willing and able, and willing obviously is a culture trait. It's something that is ingrained in culture and in mindset. And with respect to leadership, we addressed it to the characteristics of successful innovation leaders. But at the bottom line, we think that organizations need to enable their people to innovate effectively. And if you're going to in your innovation endeavor, if you're going to invest in anything, invest in people over systems, processes, or anything like that, because the people actually have to pull it off. They are sort of in the trenches of innovation, and they need to make it happen. And basically, there are two things to get right within an organization setting when it comes to skills and competences. And the one is that we have to make people aware of, let's say, the leading methodologies in innovation management, and the other one is about training people really hands-on on tools and maybe even templates to get innovation running within the organization. And when we talk about sort of the mastering the methodologies, is to really have people understand what we feel are sort of three pillars of more modern innovation, and understand the principles behind them, being sort of design thinking, which is especially relevant in the ideation process, obviously, lean startup, which is all about sort of rapid experimentation and validating your innovations. And then there's agile, obviously, around rapid development and launch of your innovations. And these sort of core methodologies are really the underlying principles of successful innovation organization. And they, by adopting sort of those principles, you create a common focus, but also common language within the organization, which helps drive the innovation process.
Yeah, and Matthijs has sort of done again, the pressure cooker summary of these three. We discussed them in more detail in our innovation playbook, but also in the webinar series of autumn last year, which is around ideation, validation, and scale up.
Yes.
So if you're interested, you can always have a look at those webinars or the corporate innovation playbook, which is available on our website. As Matthijs said, you need to get two things right. And the one thing is around mastering the methodologies. The second thing is around training the tools. I like the alliteration in this one, by the way. And that's really on a more practical level. You need to equip the people with the right toolkit and train them how to use these tools. And you will be surprised how many companies we encounter where, for example, a business model canvas does not even ring a bell, even though it's one of the, you could say, well, more established practical tools in innovation to think about how you're going to make a successful business out of it. We covered several canvases already in the previous webinars. You can use them in different stages of the innovation process. They're also, by the way, in our playbook. There's a selection of those named on this sheet. For example, we have an innovation strategy canvas that you can help to define your innovation strategy. The innovation opportunity canvas, where you can sort of summarize the ideas in the ideation phase. We're a big fan of the 3x3 growth tactics, which is kind of our adapted version of the 10 types of innovation that you can really use to enrich your innovation ideas. As said, we have the good old business model canvas, the underlying value proposition canvas, and the last one we like to mention here, but there are many others, is our portfolio management framework, which we've discussed in the second webinar of this year. And that really defines the deliverables and the criteria, but also the rarely asked questions for each stage of the innovation process. So there is a lot of sort of practical stuff that you can, equip people with to make sure that they do the right things and they also do it right in each stage of the innovation process.
And if you go to our website, you find the link to Growth Warehouse and all of these.
And then you can sort of drill down. So now we know that, there are a couple of methodologies. There is a range of tools or array of tools that your teams need to master. The next question is, how can you actually achieve that? And there are several ways to develop competencies. And we're, by the way, not a training agency, but in the end, a lot of what we do is also about building competencies in organizations. So we always say we like to maybe do it once as an example, then do it together, and then in the end, you need to do it yourself. Well, what you could do, of course, is taking part in these kind of webinars. That's always good. But on a more serious note, you could also send your people to training programs or organize your own in-house training, which is done quite a lot. But to be honest, we're not a big fan of central training programs. In our experience, a more effective way of learning is what we call innovation by doing innovation. Or, if you phrase it differently, it's basically training on the innovation job or action learning. And that means that you're going to work on innovation projects and directly internalizing the methodologies by applying them. It's about handing people the tools and directly applying them. Just fill out those canvases and see what happens. And then you, at a certain point, come to the conclusion, as what happened, for example, at SPIE, when we had a workshop, that people said, well, actually, we've been asking all the wrong questions. So they weren't asking the right questions. So, which was, I think, a key insight that came from applying a number of those tools and said, well, actually, we need to go back one step. And it's also about, making mistakes and directly learning from them. And in doing so, if you train people on the job, you'll basically have a double-edged sword. It does not only develop the skills and competences of your team, but it will also deliver direct results for your innovation projects. So I think that's something that you would like to aim for.
Yep.
There are a number of things that you could consider. This may come across a bit as a commercial break, so apologies for that. But I think it's also about sharing the experience we have with that, because we've developed a number of what we call kind of interventions that are designed to develop your innovation competencies and strengthen and accelerate your innovation funnel at the same time. That's the double-edged sword that we talked about, and we just highlight 4 of them. We're a big fan of the disruptor game, which is basically bringing people together to define future business model with a blank sheet of paper that then disrupt your own organization before somebody else does. And that's a great catalyst for innovation ideas and a good way to develop the ideation skills and competencies of your team. We did it at Van der Lande, at BD Academia, and recently some other companies as well.
Yeah, right. And for example, for company SPIE, we embarked on the Rapid Innovation Challenge. You just talked about it very briefly, where we really fundamentally challenged their projects and led them to a pivot. And we basically took those projects which are not progressing significantly or sufficiently, and applied our sort of best practice tooling to them. And it really accelerated their project development and validation skills within the organization. So that was a very powerful one. We also do innovation coaching. We just finalized a project for DPD, the logistical service provider, and we're just working alongside with them on innovative projects. And it's really about what Mark said about that, learning innovation by doing the innovation. So work is going hand in hand, and working on dilemmas, and sometimes also provide our expert opinion into each of these projects. And actually today we're working on creating an innovation lab for KLM, in which we are looking at how a centralized innovation lab can add value from technological innovations to support the business in its further growth. So those are just some examples of successful intervention from our side and companies we work with. So again, if you're interested in learning more about that, just reach out, and we're happy to share information. We have some stuff for you available. We talked about the innovation playbook, which is online. And that really talks about the frameworks, the methodologies, the tools and skills that we have available, and you can access it there. Some people were asking about our previous webinars. They're also on our website on demand, so you can watch them there. And I think we even have the download, the innovation playbook as a download available for you now, so just to make it easier for you to access that. So lots of tools that we provide, and that you can use to sort of build your innovation muscle.
Rob, the playbook is not on download.
Not yet. So,
but then you can access it on the website.
Okay.
Just quickly checking there. So with that, I think we conclude what we call season 3 of our webinar series. And we genuinely appreciate the positive feedback from several hundreds of viewers that have attended them so far, and we really enjoy sharing the insights with them. So we expect to be back in season 4 in the next second half of this year. But we're also kind of keen to learn from you which suggestions you would have in kind of the topics you would like us to cover.
Yep.
So if you have great ideas on topics that we need to cover,
burning questions
for season 4, let's make that kind of a cliffhanger, if you like. Leave the suggestions in the chat or send them later on by email. I think that sort of wraps up today's webinar.
Maybe I saw one question which I thought was maybe we could answer, I think from Wietske. The portfolio management framework being based on explore, exploit from strategizer. Well, it's somewhat linked. Let's put it that way. We found that many of the portfolio management frameworks weren't as actionable as we would like them to be. So we build our own, and it obviously has a relationship with, let's say, the governing frameworks which are out there in the market. It's not that we've come up with a completely new model in that respect, but we made it a lot more actionable for organizations to work with.
Having said that, are there any other questions from participants? And if not, that's fine as well. Thanks, by the way, for a couple of the compliments in the chat. We appreciate that. I think then we all have sort of a 2-minute break before our next meeting, which is always welcome. So on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up.
We're wrapping it up.
Thank you for attending, and hope to see you back in season 4.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Have a good day.